Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment to ask you to check me out on Patreon. There are several tiers with great benefits, including ad-free episodes delivered early to patrons. You can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com through Buy Me a Coffee or through e-transfer at crwbaird@gmail.com. Donations help keep the show going. I've also released my first history book, Canada's Main Street, the epic story of the Trans-Canada Highway. You can find it in most bookstores in Canada and through online retailers. You can find the links for Patreon, donating, and my book in my show notes. Okay, let's get to the show. In April 1823, a group of Newfoundland fur trappers encountered 3 women at Badger Bay who were in starving conditions. They had journeyed from the island's interior in search of mussels. 2 of the women died shortly after the men brought them to St. John's, and the one that remained was one of the last people left in her tribe. She spent the last years of her life sharing her culture and history. She translated English words into her own language, drew pictures of mythological figures, homes, and other artifacts, and illustrated various encounters between her people and European settlers. On June 6, 1829, her death marked the end of her people. I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X. This month I'm diving into Newfoundland's history, and today I'm sharing the story of Shanawdithit and the Beothuk people. To the Norse, it was Vinland. The English called it Newfoundland. The Portuguese gave it the name of Terra Nova. The Beothuk just called it Onawake, our land. And it truly was theirs. Anyone who visited the island would have seen a culture perfectly adapted to that place. Conical birch bark dwellings called mamatiques dotted the entire landscape. These tiny mobile villages were home to extended families of 30 to 50 people. And to survive, the Beothuk made the most of the resources that the land provided. The long, indented coast of Newfoundland and its many island waterways were the perfect place for long-distance travel. The Beothuk were skilled canoeists who not only navigated large lakes and rivers, but also the ocean. They used swift birch bark canoes which could carry up to 10 occupants and could be easily transported over land to hunt sea mammals using arrows, harpoons, and spears. Inland, they built deer fences that stretched over 60 kilometers to drive caribou to waiting hunters. One of the most important parts of this vibrant culture was the use of red ochre. They painted their canoes with it, their cultural items, even their bodies. Generation after generation thrived on the island. But that was soon to change. On May 29, 1453, the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople, bringing an end to the Byzantine Empire after 1,000 years in power. The city was renamed Istanbul, and Europe suddenly found itself cut off from the Black Sea and overland access to Asia. 4 decades later, in 1492, Christopher Columbus thought he could find a new route to Asia across the Atlantic Ocean. And contrary to popular belief, he was not out to prove that the Earth was round. Humans had known that going back to the days of the ancient Greeks. In fact, Columbus ignored many experts of the era and made numerous errors in his calculations about the circumference of the Earth. He thought Japan was 4,400 kilometers from Europe when, in fact, it was 19,600 kilometers away, and there was also a giant continent in the way. Nonetheless, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain financed his voyage across the Atlantic and promised a lifetime pension to the first person who could see land. On August 3, 1492, Columbus left with 3 ships, the Pinta, the Nina, and the Santa Maria, and after a brief stop in the Canary Islands in September, they spent 5 weeks sailing across the ocean. On October 12, 1492 at 2 a.m., Martin Alonso Penzon, a lookout on the Pinta, saw land. But he didn't get that sweet lifetime pension because Columbus said that he had already seen a light on the land a few hours earlier, and he claimed that pension for himself. Upon reaching land, Columbus met people that he called Los Indios, or Indians in English. They were in fact the Lucayan people, indigenous inhabitants of the island they called Guanahani, and they greeted Columbus and his men warmly. Unfortunately, they had gold ear ornaments, and Columbus immediately took them prisoner and demanded to know where he could get more. Months later, in March 1493, Columbus returned to a hero's welcome in Spain, and he brought with him 10 kidnapped indigenous people he used to validate his claims of gold in the land he claimed to have quote-unquote discovered. As news spread, other European rulers wanted to send their own ships in the hopes they too would return packed with gold. One man, John Cabot, believed the true path to Asia was through the Northwest Passage, and he went to Bristol, England to find financial backers for his journey. This was the second largest seaport in England, and along with enthusiastic investors, he was also granted a commission by King Henry VII of England, who would receive 1/5 of the profit from the voyage. In the spring of 1497, Cabot ventured out, but hit bad weather and turned back. A few weeks later, he once again headed west, and on June 24, 1497, John Cabot's ship, the Matthew of Bristol, appeared on the horizon of a land that would become known as Newfoundland. The ship anchored off the coast, and John Cabot, along with a few men, approached the beach in a boat. The only signs of life were the remains of a fire, a trail, nets, and a wooden tool. After getting fresh water, Cabot and his men left, hoping to return the following year. It didn't happen. In 1498, Cabot disappeared at sea on his second voyage to North America. However, the Beothuk people had been watching from the trees when Cabot first made landfall. They may have thought that these people were going to be like the last strangers who had arrived from the water. Their oral history spoke of visitors with beards, long hair, and large boats. They built homes and lived on the island for years before they disappeared. Sometimes they attacked them in bloody skirmishes. But that had been about 500 years earlier. The Norse had made the Beothuk wary of anyone who came across those waters. Perhaps they hoped that these new visitors wouldn't come back either. Sadly, they weren't that lucky, and before long, many more would arrive on their shores. That's because during his voyage in 1497, John Cabot and his crew dipped baskets into the cold waters of the Grand Banks and pulled them up, teeming with fish. Within a decade, sailors from the Basque region of northern Spain followed Cabot's route to the southern coast of Newfoundland, and that's where a series of underwater plateaus created a continental shelf, as each plateau is relatively shallow, extending down 15 to 91 meters. From the north, the cold Labrador Current hits the warm Gulf Stream from the south, mixing at the Grand Banks, which lifts nutrients to the surface from the ocean bottom and then settles on the shelf. Everything from lobster and cod to whales and dolphins feeds in this region's nutrient-rich waters. And every spring, fishermen caught fish, salted and dried them on the shore, then returned home to Europe by the end of the summer. There were no permanent European settlements yet, but their work still disrupted the lives of the Beothuk. Each time sailors arrived, the Beothuk were pushed away from their coastal grounds and into the interior of the island. With each year, it seemed more Europeans were arriving to fish the Grand Banks. Soon, they had set up temporary settlements on the coast. In 1578, after 4 years of observations, Anthony Parkhurst, a promoter of English colonization in North America, published his report on the Newfoundland fisheries. He counted 50 English ships, 100 Spanish ships, 50 Portuguese ships, and 150 boats from France. In addition, the Basques had 30 vessels just for hunting whales. 5 years later, Sir Humphrey Gilbert sailed into what would one day be St. John's Harbor. On August 5, 1583, he went ashore and assembled merchants and fishermen before his tent, where turf was cut and delivered to him to symbolize the transfer of land, which was common law in England. By doing so, he proclaimed the land to be the Queen's in perpetuity. He then levied a tax on the fishermen and took over authority of the fishing stations. It never occurred to him that the land he claimed for England had been Beothuk territory for centuries. Nearly 4 decades later, in 1612, John Guy formed the London and Bristol Company for the plantation of Newfoundland and established a settlement at Cooper's Cove on the southwest shore of Conception Bay. Most of the settlers left in less than 10 years, but this early English settlement was just the start of what was to come. Before long, more settlements popped up at Bristol's Hope, Renews, South Falkland, and Avalon to support the 10,000 sailors who fished the fertile waters. However, as the European population grew, the Beothuk were pushed farther off their land and their numbers began to decline. Their only respite from European invasion came each autumn when European fishermen left the Grand Banks and their temporary settlements to return home. Once they left, the Beothuk came out of the woods to find what they carelessly left behind. Nails, fish hooks, scraps of iron, and much more were taken by the Beothuk and turned into arrowheads, blades, and other useful tools. Each spring, the fishermen returned to find their camps empty and their structures taken apart. What the Beothuk viewed as items to be salvaged, the Europeans saw as outright theft, which caused the relationship to strain. John Guy had established that settlement of Cooper's Cove, and he knew that his new venture could not survive without trade, so he sent men to find the Beothuk in the interior of the island. They returned with no success. Each time they thought they had found a Beothuk settlement, it had been abandoned shortly before. Guy eventually went on his own trading mission. He came across Beothuk dwellings, took some items, and left an item to communicate a trade. What he didn't understand is that the Beothuk wanted nothing to do with Europeans. But John Guy wouldn't give up easily. On one of his trading expeditions, he came across a deserted Beothuk camp. Believing the Beothuk were watching from the trees, he hoisted a white flag and waved it. Separated by a river, 8 men came out of the trees and lit a signal fire. In response, John Guy encouraged them to cross and join his party, and after a short while of hand gestures to communicate his desire to trade, some of the Beothuk waded across. Guy said their entire bodies were covered with red ochre and their hair was entwined with feathers. They stood bold and upright, wearing animal furs including beaver skin collars, as the leader kissed the tip of his fingers and gestured towards them. The Beothuk gave long speeches which John Guy and his men did not understand, and then they began to dance. And once they had exhausted themselves, they sat down for a meal. Guy made sure to serve them a lavish feast of bread, butter, raisins, and beer. In return, the Beothuk provided caribou meat and root vegetables. The feast was described as lively and filled with laughter. The Beothuk gave Guy and his men furs and received a linen cap, 2 towels, 3 knives, a piece of brass, a shirt, 2 napkins, gloves, 12 spices, a hatchet, a knife, 4 threaded needles, and a pair of scissors in return. John Guy really wanted to make a good impression, and that night the Beothuk communicated to them they would be safe for the night. Then the 2 groups agreed to return to that spot in 1 year to negotiate some more. However, what could have been a prosperous trading relationship was thwarted by a tragic misunderstanding. A year went by, and as promised, the Beothuk returned to the designated spot to wait for the Englishmen, but John Guy's delegation never arrived. The snow had been especially heavy that winter, and the Englishmen had been forced to turn back after only 2 days. Meanwhile, the Beothuk waited, and when they saw a fishing boat approaching them, the group went out to greet them thinking it was John Guy's party. It wasn't. Those aboard the boat believed the Beothuk were hostile. They fired their guns and killed several Beothuk as they fled. Those who survived viewed the entire incident as treachery. They never forgave, and they never forgot. And from then on, they refused to trade with Europeans, whose numbers just kept growing. European expansion, mostly by the English, grew throughout the 1700s. That meant they cut down forests to build their settlements and dammed rivers to fish salmon, and by 1708, George Skeffington had built a commercial fishery that could cure and process salmon from the Gander, Exploit, and Indian Arm rivers. They did this before the salmon reached the spawning grounds in Beothuk territory, which limited their access to the much-needed fish, leading them to retaliate for the first time. In 1720, the Beothuk smashed weirs, destroyed nets, and killed several men who worked for Skeffington. In response, the company sent 30 armed men into Beothuk territory. When they were unable to find anyone, they returned, but this was just the first of many attacks. And over the next few years, the Beothuk continued to raid English settlements, mostly at night or while settlers were away working. But it was a dangerous endeavor for both parties. One day, Thomas Rosewell was drying salmon at his weir when the Beothuk showed up. He had a reputation for killing Beothuk, and his body was later found, naked, covered in arrow wounds. He had also been beheaded. In retaliation, Roselle's friends gave chase and ambushed 2 parties of Beothuk in canoes and killed several of them. The tit-for-tat escalation continued, and in the mid-1760s, the fortified house of a shipmaster was attacked by the Beothuk. The shipmaster and 4 crew members were killed, and they wouldn't be the last. When 5 Englishmen attempted to start a settlement in Halls Bay, they were later found decapitated with their heads on poles. The Beothuk showed no mercy to those who fished their rivers, but the same could not be said for trappers who typically worked alone and lived off the land. The Beothuk didn't harm them, but instead took their traps, and overall their attacks were nothing compared to the brutality they faced from colonizers. And settlers made no secret of their hatred for the Beothuk. They routinely made trips into the interior to steal their furs, destroy canoes, and pillage their homes. They showed no hesitation to kill either. In 1775, near Trinity Bay, an armed group of white settlers came upon a group of Beothuk people sleeping. They murdered 7 of them. One man, said to stand well over 6 feet, was shot several times before he died. His body was towed behind the settlers' boat before it was cut loose. The man's body eventually washed up at Lance Cove, where people gawked at him like he was a chilling tourist attraction until he rotted away and was swept out to sea. And as the years went by, the persecution of the Beothuk people continued. John Peyton Sr. ran a salmon and fur post at Sandy Point, near the mouth of the Exploits River. Over the years, equipment, including salmon nets and a boat, had been stolen several times by the Beothuk. Peyton Sr., along with 2 other men, Harry Miller and Thomas Taylor, were given permission to find the Beothuk responsible. They walked along the coast for 3 days, and when they found a group processing caribou skins, they fired their guns. The Beothuk fled, but Peyton Sr., Miller, and Taylor managed to kill many Beothuk that day. It's unknown how many, but it's believed to be at least 24 people died. Peyton Sr. said the entire event was, quote, a glorious expedition. But the 3 men's thirst for Beothuk blood had not been quenched. Later that year, Peyton discovered a Beothuk man who had stolen one of his traps and was fashioning it into arrowheads. Peyton beat the man to death with the trap and then took everything from his camp. In 1790, Harry Miller led 8 men to raid Beothuk winter settlements. 4 days later, they found one and let their dogs chase down 2 women and an infant. None of the settlers ever faced punishment. Instead, killing a Beothuk was a matter of pride. Men would tally their kills on gun butts and brag about murdering women and children. But one man opposed this behavior, and he abhorred the killing and persecution of the Beothuk. Lieutenant John Cartwright was sent by the British government to find Beothuk in the late 1700s, but he didn't find any. Instead, he discovered the settlers' brutality. His report led to a change in Newfoundland law making it illegal to kill a Beothuk. But by then, the Beothuk avoided white men at all costs. In 1807, Governor John Holloway offered a reward for anyone who could establish friendly relations with them. This meant that if someone could convince a Beothuk to go to St. John's so the new policy could be explained, they would receive £50. The reward was eventually doubled. However, the policy had an adverse effect. Instead of encouraging friendly relations, it led to white settlers going into the interior to forcefully kidnap people for a reward. The British government had essentially put a bounty on Beothuk's lives, and that was on top of their brutal expansion into their lands that left the Beothuk with no access to fishing grounds. The Beothuk had been pushed to territories that could not support them, and many starved to death over many winters. Those who survived were often killed by diseases because they had no immunity to illnesses like tuberculosis and smallpox. And by 1801, the once thriving Beothuk population had dwindled down to a handful of people. They had survived for millennia on this land, and now they were going extinct. And that year a baby was born that would be known as the last of her people. Shanawdithit's early life is unknown to us, other than that she was born around 1801 near a large lake in the Newfoundland interior. Almost from the start, she was surrounded by death and pain. She and her family tried to live a traditional life in the interior of the island, away from white settlers, but even then, as a child, while washing venison in the river, a white man shot her. Her recovery took months. The settlers, though, would not leave them alone. In 1819, John Peyton Jr., the son of the man who massacred Beothuks decades earlier, was looking for the Beothuk he believed had looted his boat. His party found a camp, belonging to Shanawdithit's family. They immediately fled their camp, and in the process, a woman fell and Peyton and his men grabbed her. At that moment, Shanawdithit's people turned around and advanced on the settlers as Peyton and his men backed up and stopped. In the standoff, Chief Shanawdithit stepped out holding a spruce branch. He gave a passionate speech for 10 minutes, then shook hands with everyone. He believed the matter had been resolved and went to retrieve Demasduit. Chief Shanawdithit and Demasduit were Shanawdithit's aunt and uncle, although she was not with the party at the time. Peyton's men refused to release her, and a Beothuk man took out an axe. The white men threatened him with guns as they dragged the woman away and stabbed Shanawdithit in the back. He, however, managed to turn around and kill the man who attacked him. Then he stabbed another white man with a dagger as he approached him, and he then went after a third man before Peyton shot him. Chief Shanawdithit fell to the ground, but before he could be defeated, he stood up, gave a deathly stare, lifted his dagger and screamed. He then rushed at the closest white man before he was finally shot dead in a hail of gunfire. As the other Beothuk fled, the white men dragged his wife away with her infant son. Her son died 2 days later. A few months later, the government attempted to return her to her people, but sadly by then she was sick with tuberculosis and died on January 8, 1820. Her body was put on a lakeshore for her people to find, and she was buried beside her husband. Meanwhile, as Shanawdithit fought to survive, she saw her family slowly die around her. With each winter, the size of her family decreased. In 1823, her father fell through the ice and died. Soon after, Shanawdithit was walking along Notre Dame Bay with her mother, Dude Bouchette, and an unnamed sister, as well as another father and daughter. They were seen by trapper and fisherman William Cull. When the father and daughter approached him asking for food, he shot them. Cull then took the remaining women to St. John's, where Shanawdithit's mother and sister died soon after of tuberculosis. William Cull was put on trial for killing 2 Beothuk, but was acquitted due to lack of evidence. He then demanded that the government pay him a reward for bringing 3 Beothuk to St. John's. Meanwhile, Shanawdithit was alone in a sea of settlers who renamed her Nancy April. She wasn't allowed to return to her people, if there were any left in the interior. Instead, she was taken to the home of John Peyton Jr., the man who had killed her uncle and kidnapped her aunt, where she became a servant. In the 5 years she was in his service, she learned English and was then taken to the home of William Cormac, part of a prominent family in Newfoundland. He had been educated in Scotland and eventually returned to the island to take over the family business. As a young man, he had been fascinated by the Beothuk and led several expeditions into the interior to establish friendly relations. But despite his best efforts, he never found a single Beothuk on his trips. And deeply concerned about their plight, he wrote to Lord Bathurst, the British colonial secretary, and expressed his desire to help them. On October 2, 1827, he founded the Beothuk Institute with the hopes of establishing open communication with the original inhabitants of the island and learn about their history. And while his intentions were fueled by a desire to help, he also wanted to assimilate them into British society with no regard for their traditions or culture. But let me be clear, his intentions were not pure. The same year he founded the Institute, he stole the skulls of Demasduit and her husband from their graves. He sent them to Robert Jameson, the professor of natural history at the University of Edinburgh, to be studied. When Shanawdithit moved into his home, he began to talk with her about her people and her culture. And through their discussions, she drew sketches of Beothuk settlements, their tools, and mapped their territory. In early 1829, William Cormac went to England to share his findings, and while he was gone, she was moved to the home of Attorney General James Sims. But by then, Shanawdithit was in frail health. She only lived for 9 more months, and on June 6, 1829, Shanawdithit died of tuberculosis. After her death, Dr. William Carson performed a post-mortem. Her skull was sent to the Royal College of Physicians in London, where it remained until it was moved to the Royal College of Surgeons in 1938, but it was eventually destroyed in the German Blitz bombing of London during the Second World War. The rest of her remains were buried in a graveyard in St. John's, which was covered over to build a railroad line in 1903. The church next to it was torn down in 1963, and now only a plaque remains to identify Shanawdithit's final resting place. In 2000, the federal government recognized her as a National Historic Person, and that same year, a statue titled The Spirit of the Beothuk was unveiled at Boyd's Cove to honor her. And that's because she left behind an incredible legacy. Her drawings and writings have helped preserve the stories and culture of her people for future generations. She ensured that the Beothuk were not erased from history. In 2015, Chief Miaseljo of the Miapukek First Nation at Kone River began the process to repatriate the remains of Shanawdithit's aunt and uncle, where he performed a sweetgrass ceremony for Demasduit and Nonosabusut. Often called smudging, the traditional indigenous practice uses smoke from dried, braided sweetgrass to purify people, places, and objects by attracting positive energy, healing, and good thoughts. A year later, Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Dwight Ball requested that the remains be returned to Canada. Melanie Joly, Federal Canadian Heritage Minister, made the same request. In 2019, 4 years after the process began, Gordon Rintoul, the director of National Museums Scotland, announced an agreement had been reached, and soon those remains would be returned. It was a bit of good news amid a long history of tragedy. When Shanawdithit died, many, including William Cormack, believed that she was the last of her people, and for decades, historians accepted it as fact. However, that may not be true. Neighboring First Nations never believed that the Beothuk disappeared. They say that as Europeans expanded further into their territory, the Beothuk moved north to the Innu and south to the Micmac and joined their nations. In 1910, Stony, a 75-year-old woman who claimed she was the daughter of a Micmac mother and Beothuk father, recorded a song in the Beothuk language. She said she had learned that song from her father. And in 2007, DNA testing from Demasduit and Nonosabusut's teeth assigned them to the haplogroup X and haplogroup C, which are DNA markers found in some Micmac populations, lending further evidence to the theory that the Beothuk joined other nations. But most interestingly, a tiny portion of the Icelandic population belongs to haplogroup C. The prevailing theory is that these Icelanders have First Nations ancestry, possibly arising from when the Norse arrived in North America around 1000 CE. But that is a story for next week's episode, when we go back to the era of the Vikings and their explorations of Newfoundland and Labrador. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.